Good morning, Patrick. Thank you for joining me this morning. You had created this wonderful atlas, which was featured in a Bloomberg article, and I assume that's kind of how Charlotte found out about it. And so you were invited to give your presentation about your atlas to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Planning Commission, which was recorded, but unfortunately the audio is out of sync and is echoing, and so kind of unwatchable for people who might want to find out the information that you shared. And so I've reached out, and you have graciously agreed to re-record the presentation for our benefit so we can kind of share it and get the information that you've worked so hard on out to people here in Charlotte. So I'll just turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Connie, for doing this. And it was also not only unwatchable, it was difficult to deliver because I was hearing myself echo while I was speaking. So very thankful for this, and hopefully we can get it up online and spread the word to the entire country, really, because that's the point of the Atlas of Inner City Highway Impacts, of which Charlotte is one city of 142 that I have included. And I'll be going through some of the information on Charlotte in specific, since of course that was the request, but also talking about sort of the background of inner city highways, how we built them, what went wrong, and some of the information of how we got to this point. So I'm going to share my screen here. There we go. Are you seeing the full presentation mode?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, like I said, this is the Atlas of Inner City Highway Impacts, and I just want to be clear that this is about highways built through the center of cities, and I want to just have that delineation between inner city highways and what I would call intra-city highways, which are highways that connect different metropolitan areas. Say from Charlotte to Raleigh was the original intent of the interstate system, not necessarily to build highways through the center of cities, having a negative impact on real estate and the downtowns of American cities. And as Connie mentioned, this is from an article from Bloomberg where they covered this story, which can be found online, and StreetsBlog has also covered it, and a few other sources as well. But again, this was for a presentation for the Mecklenburg Planning Commission. My name is Patrick Kennedy. I'm the founder of the Human Ecosystem.City, which is a consultation and think tank on urban issues related to transportation, real estate development, et cetera, et cetera. Also, I'm on the board of directors of Dallas Area Rapid Transit and a professor of master's program of sustainable urban development at Southern Methodist University here in Dallas. So I'll be talking a little bit about Dallas issues and then also trying to translate those to how they tell a story of a broader issue and how they relate to Charlotte. So to get to that point, I want to give a little bit of background and introduction to myself and my sort of history of studying highways, because it's been kind of a 20+ year process to this point. And when I first moved to Dallas out of college, I wanted to go to the most sprawling, car-dependent place I could find, and I think I found it. But I wanted to walk to work, and I had an office in downtown Dallas, and there was only about 200 housing units in downtown Dallas at the time. And so the closest I could find was in an area called Deep Ellum. And this was my walk to work every single day, past boarded up buildings, vacant properties, surface parking lots. And this sort of introduced me to just thinking about why in the 9th largest city in the country and the 4th largest metropolitan economy in the country, why was this land effectively useless or valueless? And you can see that the highway up above is packed with cars while the surface street is fairly empty. And to me, it was like, okay, those are probably all the same cars that have been there, stuck in traffic the entire time. So this is not really working as a piece of infrastructure. And ultimately, that led to me proposing to remove that highway, I-345, through the center of downtown Dallas, created a nonprofit called A New Dallas, which eventually turned into a political action committee to get involved in local politics called Coalition for a New Dallas, to focus on this particular issue, but then also talk about broader things of what kind of city do we want to be long term and how do we get there in terms of our public investments. And to make that case, I wanted to make the case to the business community. And that was to say, okay, what is the economic impact if we were to remove that highway and look at, okay, what's the development potential of not just the right of way, but all the negatively impacted land that was all effectively vacant or service parking lots along that highway, which is sort of the study area I highlighted in black on there. And what I found was that there's barely any improvements on there. So it's barely, generating any kind of property tax revenue, only about $3 million per year to the city back in 2012. And we could actually use this land to correct the market, because in downtown at the time, we were having issues where land values or land costs were too high due to speculation and rents were too low. And so development just was not happening. And so the theory was, if we could let the market correct itself by letting it price land as it needs to, then it could actually deliver the kind of housing, and particularly affordable housing, that we needed near jobs and near transit, which is abundant in downtown Dallas. And what I found at the time was that this would be worth about $4 billion in private investment and new tax base that would generate over $110 million per year in property tax revenue, which would be a huge increase from what it was before. And also add 25,000 new residents and 22,000 new jobs, right? The type of growth that's happening further and further and further away from downtown Dallas, we wanted to re-centralize it where we want it. And the first question was always, well, what's going to happen to the traffic? At the time, we had about 140,000 cars per day, which was effectively at its highway capacity or for moving traffic. And what I found is a lot of that is also truck traffic. So we could actually remove the truck traffic, which is what the interstate system is effectively for, to go around the city rather than having trucks, taking up space and emitting pollution where we want the most people to be. We send that around the city, then all of a sudden we've got a lot less traffic that we can deal with. And by removing the highway, we can actually correct some capacity problems in the grid by reconnecting the north-south streets, which are largely under-trafficked, which is a bad thing if you're trying to attract retailers to bring, vibrancy to a city. That we have lots of potential capacity that's unmet, plenty more than we actually need. And I'll get more into the traffic when TxDOT gets involved in this story. But in general, what we said was, okay, let's remove this piece of infrastructure with these several unsightly elevated bridges and replace it with the kind of places people want to live. So walkable, mixed use, mixed income, urban development. This is what it would look like as we were to rebuild it. We talked about the amount of private investment that it would create. And ultimately, our efforts there, we launched a website. It got 22,000 hits on the first day because the Dallas Morning News covered it. And then I got a call from one of the commissioners over Texas Transportation, or TxDOT, one of the 5 commissioners appointed by the governor. And he said, what are you talking about here? And so I ended up meeting with him. And he said, okay, we'll look at it. And for the first time ever, TxDOT did an analysis of looking at removing a highway. And not just looking at removing it, but not thinking about solely traffic and moving cars, but thinking about what is the economic and environmental impact of the various scenarios that they were going to look at. And having many more resources and a several $1 million contract to do this, they were able to do a deep dive in where the traffic is coming and going to. And what they found is roughly about half of it is coming to the downtown area, which means roughly about half of it doesn't need to be coming through downtown. And then that traffic that is coming to the greater downtown area, it has to get onto surface streets at some point anyway. So just get it onto the surface streets earlier without having the highway, and then send the regional or interstate traffic around the city on the Beltway. And so they created several scenarios looking at what's the existing version where they would just modify it, remove a couple bridges, have a below grade trench option, which would actually be an expansion of the highway, and a scenario where they would turn it into a boulevard and really maximize the capacity of the city streets that exist. And what they found was, what I want to highlight is in the red box here, is the total hours of delay between those 3 scenarios is effectively minimal, 0, right? There would be no difference in traffic impacts by removing the highway, which was incredible. And they basically came out and said exactly what we said would happen, that the traffic would handle itself. Now, they do come back and say there would be increased delay on the city streets, but we actually want more traffic on those city streets for the reasons that I mentioned about vibrancy. Some of the great Miracle Mile type streets around around the country, like Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles, Michigan Avenue in Chicago, Van Ness in San Francisco. These all carry 45 to 50,000 vehicles per day. So to me, I think traffic is not something to be feared so much as utilized, right? And what's more important is moving slowly and safely rather than either fast, like highways are intended to, or stuck in traffic when the highways fail. And so the broader point that I end up getting to is that inner city highways fail for either two reasons. One, they fail a city economically, or they fail as traffic if the economics are still working in a city. And I'm going to explain that further as we get into it. As I mentioned, they also looked at the economic impact, and what they found was exactly what we found, is that the removal option would be the lowest cost and the highest return. Now, I had several critiques of how their methodology worked for their economic development, and I think it's a lot higher than what they're showing here and a lot lower for the expanded trench option. But I think they had their thumb on the scales, and it still shows that the removal option was the best option. Ultimately, this led to the Congress for New Urbanism adding I-345 to their biannual freeways without futures list 3 times in a row. And that led to, in their 25th anniversary compendium of 25 great ideas of new urbanism, they interviewed me and Peter Park, who's become a friend and mentor along the way, because he was the planning director in Milwaukee when they removed a freeway. And I would highly encourage people to search this on Google and read the entire interview. So to answer the question about what to do with the infrastructure, how to invest in it, how to plan it, how to design it, I think we have to ask a bigger question, and that's, what is the purpose of the city as we live in it? And I would argue that transportation infrastructure ultimately should be subservient to the form and function of urban economies and human need, which to me is that cities exist to facilitate social and economic exchange, bringing people together to transact and interact, and do so in an efficient and optional manner, meaning it gives people choice in how to get around and where to live, where to work, really maximizing choice rather than creating car dependence. And so I wanted to look further at, okay, what is not just the impact of the highways that we built? This happens to be the construction of a highway through downtown Kansas City, which ultimately led to a downtown loop. And that wasn't the entirety of the impact, of course, because it has a negative bleeding impact on the surrounding private real estate. And I'll show that here. Is today, we see, this is the surface parking map in downtown Kansas City, basically ringing the entire downtown. Now, in the southern half of downtown, you can see that it's kind of functional, but when you actually look into it, it's a significant amount of public investment. These are convention center space or convention conference space that spans the highway. And, it kind of helps mitigate the sort of local area problem, but it doesn't solve the macro problem of spending $1 billion on the highway and probably more than $1 billion on these public arenas and convention centers to try to mitigate the negative impact that those highways have, which is still not just devaluing the surrounding area, but it's exporting value and exacerbating sprawl, encouraging people to move further and further and further away, rather than where you want people, which is where you have existing infrastructure. Now, this is a map of downtown Dallas. And on the left in red is unproductive land, vacant land, service parking lots, basically dysfunctional land that's not being invested in. And you can see in red that it's basically mapping along the highways because parking often becomes the highest and best use next to a highway. And then in orange, that's also unproductive land because it's tax exempt property. It ends up becoming publicly invested things like arts districts, convention centers, and things like that. And so the map shows sort of the center of the central business district would seem functional, but when you map it in cross section and look at the vacant floors of where the office buildings are, and this is pre-pandemic, so it's even worse today, but half the floors effectively are vacant as well. So even then, it's not functioning from an economic standpoint and probably not paying the bills. So getting into the atlas, I really started to think about, okay, how much land value is tied up in public right-of-way now for these highways, and what's the land worth, and why did we do this if we consider it a mistake? And so from that standpoint, I had to dig into the history of the highway system. And that's when I found notes from a presidential meeting with President Eisenhower, where he first said, that highways to the center of the congested parts of cities were entirely against his original concept and wishes. And so this meeting was actually potentially transformational for the future of the country. And I'm going to get into what happened there. But Eisenhower's history after World War I, as a lieutenant, I think he was tasked with basically creating a parade across the entire country and in celebration of victory. And he ended up getting stuck in the mud trying to get around. And so he had always been thinking about this. And then in World War II, of course, he experienced the German Autobahn, which primarily is not also built through the center of cities. But he realized that this is a terrific way to get people from one side of the country to another side of the country. And ultimately, this became his primary domestic program, was the creation of the interstate system. A number of historians that I've read, there seems to be fairly conclusive that the defense part of this, of the name of it, was mostly just for marketing and for winning votes. And even the Army was like, this is not a great way to move things through the center of cities. So whatever that's worth. But ultimately, it did get funded and get passed. But how did we build the highways to the center of the cities is the question, or intercity highways. And that became essentially a debate of two men that were also in that meeting with Eisenhower in 1960, which is General John Stuart Bragdon, who served under Eisenhower, effectively building bridges and whatnot during the war. He became Eisenhower's appointment to be the advisor for the interstate system. And the man on the right is Bertram Tallerman, director of the Bureau of Public Roads at the time, who was previously New York State, essentially transportation director. Now, because he was from New York State, he was an acolyte of Robert Moses. If you're familiar with Robert Moses, a man who wore many hats, but basically the highway builder of New York City and New York State. And Moses was also a consultant for the Bureau of Public Roads, and he said that highways or new expressways should go right through the center of cities and not around them. And if you're familiar with Moses and ultimately toward the end of his career, he tried to build 3 crosstown highways through Manhattan and failed at all of them. And I'll come back to those proposed crosstown highways in a second. But Bragdon argued that there should be no intercity highways and there should be no intercity highway loops. And so why? And he argued that first it was purpose, right? This was about the interstate system and not to serve local traffic, because he and his staff understood that if you mix local traffic with interstate traffic, you're going to create congestion and you're going to create delay. And so part of this research, I dug into archives of Dallas Morning News and found the studies that were essentially advocating for the creation of some of these intercity highways, saying that in 1958, survey showed that about 500,000 vehicles were entering and leaving downtown area in 24 hours. And the forecast was that by 1980, this would more than double to over 1 million vehicles. Well, today I looked at the traffic and it's about 584,000. So even though the region has increased by about 8 times in population, metro population, the traffic is barely different. And they also said, well, if you look at the traffic counts, 28,000 trucks entered and left downtown. Of these, 20,000 were just passing through and not actually stopping. And they argued, well, this is the reason why we need to expand and build highways to the center of cities, rather than say, well, what if we put it around the city where it probably would belong and do better? And this was an article about the particular highway that I tried to remove because it was going to be the costliest road in the entire country at the time. Now, in Bragdon's report in 1960 that he presented to the president, he argued that, excuse me, that mixing the traffic would cause these highways to need to be over 40 lanes wide in some cities to actually manage the traffic that they were projecting, kind of like that survey in Dallas was projecting. But that would be better served by just one good rail line, which would carry the same amount of people and serve the local needs better. And I'm showing the widest highway in the country right now is the Katy Freeway in Houston, which is 26 lanes, widened at great expense, and it's now slower than what it was before. So where he said there should be no intercity loops and interchanges should be not closer than 2 miles apart I found is a very effective way to explain how this fails. Right? Because we end up having all these highways coming into downtown. They have to obviously have interchanges to get to them. And here in downtown Dallas, they're all about a mile apart. And what's interesting is that we've got that 584,000 vehicles coming and going from the downtown area, but it actually is a multiplier effect on the traffic because the vehicles end up having to use multiple segments of this to get around, and it causes these interchanges to individually fail, but because they're so close together that it creates a cascading effect of failure that we have to deal with that basically ripples throughout the entire system, both on the freeways and in the surface network that's attached to it. Bragdon's other major issue was, his task was to deliver the interstate system on time and on budget. And the intercity highways, what he found was that on a per mile basis, they were costing 10 times what the average cost of was the rest of the interstate system. And so the initial program that was budgeted to be $25 billion ended up going $100 billion over budget in $1960. This ended up becoming something like the equivalent of about $750 billion in today's money. So you can just see this is a huge, huge program, of course. And I talked about the I-345 being one of the most expensive highways in the country. It was over 12 million at the time just for the right of way. So over half the cost of it was just acquiring the real estate because it was expensive because people were living there. People were, shopping there. There were businesses and whatnot. And this was the equivalent of about $884 million per mile. Very expensive even today. Now, Eisenhower's issue and Bragdon's issue was not necessarily of displacement, but ultimately that would become an issue for the Kennedy administration. And the irony of this sort of battle between Bragdon and Tallamy is that Eisenhower ultimately never made a decision. He said he would, but he didn't. And by not making a decision, he effectively made his decision. And an author named Megan Kimball in her book City Limits went to the Eisenhower libraries and found the reason for that. Because in the secretary's notes that she found that Eisenhower effectively didn't want to negatively impact his vice president's presidential campaign, and that was Richard Nixon. And Nixon lost to Kennedy, and this became Kennedy's problem. So it's kind of ironic in a tragic way, but that displacement that we ended up experiencing was averaging 100,000 people per year throughout the 1960s and 1970s, just a massive number of people getting moved out of their homes. And these homes, effectively, that Robert Moses wanted to remove in Manhattan ultimately became what he considered slums, some of the most valuable real estate in the entire world. Right, Soho, Chelsea, the places in Manhattan. And the U.S. Congress at the time was experiencing extreme levels of lobbying to deliver this system and deliver the inner city highways, because I believe the lobbyists knew that they were creating a monopoly of transportation and an increased demand, effectively, of car dependence, that you would have to buy gas, buy oil, buy cars, and everybody would have to. And so we were told that freeways would create cities that are desirable, that are beneficial, beautiful, would stimulate rising land value, and would prevent the spreading of blight. Now, I would argue it did the opposite of all of those things. What happened was Tallamy ultimately waived this book, the Yellow Book, infamously known, that was these sort of cartoonish maps of every city, or most cities. And these maps were shown to Congress people to say, hey, we're planning on building highways through the center of cities. And because they saw those maps, they agreed to effectively the gas tax and the highway trust fund to fund the interstate system. Now, what happened was, this was the Yellow Book map of Dallas in 1955. And then shortly after it's funded, that map turned into the map on the right. Not all of those were built, but people were drunk on all of that highway money that was coming into cities. And the question is, okay, where were they built? And we start mapping the highways compared to the homeowners loan corporation map, famously known as red line map. Red areas were largely black and brown communities that the HOLC determined was not safe for investing in and would not give loans to for housing. And what this was obviously effectively racism. And when we look at where it was built in Charlotte, you can see that the highway system tracks almost perfectly with where the redlined areas were in Charlotte. And this was not unique to either Dallas or Charlotte, but this happened in New Orleans, in Treme, in Greenwood, in Tulsa, Sugar Hill, in Los Angeles, which was effectively Black Hollywood, Overtown in Miami, Rondo in St. Paul, Black Bottom in Detroit, and Hastings Street which was the epicenter of Motown at the time, and you can see before and after. And of course, Dallas, where I am now, in Deep Ellum neighborhood, which is the epicenter of jazz and blues culture in Texas. And then the question becomes of that cost, that extreme cost, because the inner city highway system alone, which was 1/10 of the mileage, ended up being half the overall cost. I looked at what was the opportunity cost if we had taken Bragdon's conclusions and said, what if we used half that money and built a rail network in cities to serve local traffic? And what I found was that at the cost that Montreal was building their starter subway system, we could have built the equivalent of 4,800 miles of subway lines across the country, which is 36 entire Paris metro systems. That's just the scale of how much we invested in these highways, and in particular these inner city highways that demolished cities. And since we have spent over $12 trillion on the highway system at the local, state, federal level, a lot of which is just maintenance. And since then, China has built spent $2 trillion on this high-speed rail network across their country. So lastly, that brings me to the Atlas of Inner City Highway Impacts. And to discuss the Atlas, I want to sort of give the foundation for it, which is some of the studies and research that I found along the way. One of which was a 2011 Upjohn Institute analysis of a 2006 Federal Highway Administration Commission report on the economic returns of highway investment. And what the Upjohn Institute found was the conclusion of that FHWA report just said, on average, there's about a 35% net rate of return to the broader economy. But in the Upjohn Institute, they dug into it and said, well, those returns have effectively diminished. And there was a lot of value to the initial interstate highway system, but there's really no return on investment at all today, right? So every dollar spent is effectively just a short-term jobs program. And another was a Philadelphia Federal Reserve study from 2021 that I found that their conclusion was effectively within about a 3-mile radius of downtowns, that highways shift from being an amenity to attractive or to real estate and growth outside of that 3-mile radius, but inside of that 3-mile radius, it's a disamenity, and it causes population and real estate value loss. And so that's when I started creating these maps of 3-mile radii on all these cities across the country. And I also added 1-mile radius because I wanted to understand the difference in value within the downtown area, and then sort of the greater downtown area, or the 3-mile radius. And sort of the interesting thing about that 3-mile radius, it's almost perfectly what the périphérique is in Paris. And you can see at the bottom just the scale of Paris and Amsterdam's highway loop versus Dallas and Houston's highway loop. Now compare that to London. London's 15 miles radius on average, so much wider. A book I came across called The Elephant in the Bedroom, which was written in early 90s by a couple of California engineers. In that I quote, Pasadena in the mid-1970s lost 10% of its property tax rolls because of the construction of the Route 210 freeway, which sliced through the city's heart, carrying much of its retail trade to neighboring cities. And after I read that, that's when I realized I want to understand how much value was taken away and tax base was removed from cities all over the country, and quantify it. And that ultimately became the Atlas of Inner City Highways. And so the other sort of foundational book here was that yellow book that I mentioned earlier. And in the yellow book, there was essentially criteria that small cities would have a bypass and a stub, medium-sized cities would have a bypass and a throughway. And I show Greenville, South Carolina here intentionally because South Carolina happened to have a senator in Congress that, as governor previously, he had fought with his state highway engineers and refused to allow any of this interstate highway money to go through center cities of South Carolina cities. And so what you'll see if you explore many South Carolina cities, they've not been demolished, and there are no inner city highways in South Carolina. And then Memphis, as an example of a large city, large cities were intended to have beltways, what we call orbitals, and they could have as many sort of radials going through the center city as they want, effectively. Now I include Memphis and Baltimore here too, both around 1 million people at the time. Well, Baltimore never connected all of those highways through the center of cities as radials, and Memphis, according to plan, did not build the east-west one, but they ended up building a north-south one instead. And I can let you intuit where the wealthy white areas were and where the poor black areas were in Memphis. Now, oddly enough, there were no North Carolina cities in the Yellow Book, and I'm not quite sure why. Maybe it's because the cities were too small, but there is also some other small cities. So I'm not entirely sure why North Carolina doesn't have any, but this is a map of Charlotte around 1935. There's about a 3-mile radius from center to edge. And if I was to argue, that's probably where the highway loop should have been built. Another interesting study I found, that's something that's done annually by the American Transportation Research Institute. They look at the top 100 bottlenecks across the country, and I'm showing their data of some of these intercity highways in Texas cities. So in Houston, I-45, in Dallas, I-45, but really 345, and Austin and I-35. And what happens here is that they are failing as their one and only job, which is moving traffic. They are moving cars at the speed of surface streets for 12 to 14 hours per day. So maybe not failing economically, although they are devaluing real estate, but they're failing at transportation. And that really becomes sort of the key thesis of this, is that intercity highways are failing in one way or another. And so I also dug into Federal Highway Administration data and started charting it, because they've got incredible data, but they haven't put it on a per capita basis. And so I charted the per capita of vehicle miles traveled in each metropolitan area and the freeway lane miles per capita. So effectively the highway capacity, or the amount of highways in every metro area. And what this shows is that the more highway capacity that a metro region has, just the more everybody drives. So everybody has to drive more, right? You're driving further, you're driving longer, probably stuck in more traffic. So what are we actually achieving by building more highways? I also looked at what is the average width of, or how many lanes in a metro area. And what this shows is on the bottom, on the x-axis, is the average number of lanes of the highways in a metro area, and the average amount of traffic per lane in that metro area. And so if you have a 8-lane highway, you're going to have much more traffic on each lane. And so to me, this became proof of a concept we call of induced demand, which is just creating more driving for everybody. Also found this study by Mineta Transportation Institute, which is a consortium of research universities. And what I want to highlight here is what they found is the cost of that access to a vehicle led to an increase in income because you could access more jobs. And for poor families, though, that cost or that income is dwarfed by the cost of the vehicle, even a used car, right? Much cheaper than, say, a new car. And so we think that the car helps us get to jobs, but ultimately the cost of the car exceeds that. And so it just puts people effectively on a hamster wheel that they can't actually get ahead. So I would argue that this car dependence that we create is actually a negative impact on the American dream, which is to get ahead and improve your lot in life. And I started looking at all the different ways that highways are failing from an economic standpoint. And I created this analysis called highway function ratio, which is how well the highway is actually working in a city versus the metro GDP per household. And then I started looking at every single way I could think about, okay, how do highways chart against various economic indicators, from metro median income to downtown resident income to last mile speed versus assessed value of real estate. And everything I looked at, it was basically negative impact the highways were having on local economies. So that brings me to the particular sheet of Charlotte. And so as I mentioned, I've got 142 different cities that have this exact same information. And I'm going to go through each one of these little windows so they're actually legible. As I mentioned, there is no, what I'm showing not available. That's the yellow book. All the other cities, or at least over half of them, have yellow book maps of what the original intention was of the highway system and comparing that to what was actually built. Some have adhered to it pretty closely and some have done very different. So here is the network map of the 1 mile radius and the 3 mile radius. You can see I-77 is the one that sort of slashes through on a southwest to northeast tangent. And here is the map of the current highway network overlaid on the 1970 census map of the African American population. And again, just like with showing the maps of the red line neighborhoods, you can see how this tracks. Now, some of the key data points that I want to call out where Charlotte's really sort of notable, I think, is first, within that 1 mile highway radius, there's about $4 billion worth of redevelopment potential in highway right-of-way. And just looking at the highway right-of-way, not the surrounding impact either. And then in the 3 mile radius, about 6.5 billion in total. What this means is there's effectively about 8.35% of the total property tax revenue to the city of Charlotte has been lost by just that 3 mile radius. And I also wanted to compare, because we often see studies that say, oh, congestion costs the country, $180 billion a year or something. And when you actually prorate that on a per driver, per person rate, is actually very low. In Charlotte, that happens to be $289 per driver. Now we compare that to another data point I put together, which is the annualized household infrastructure life cycle costs plus the cost of driving. So taking the average miles driven per household, multiplying that by the IRS's sort of annual cost of driving per mile in each metro area, and then adding up all that highway lane miles and then putting together a number that is the cost to rebuild it over a 30-year lifespan, annualized over a per year basis, and then the annual cost of maintaining that. And you add up all those things, that ends up being $32,000 in the Charlotte metro area. So just the cost of having all those highways, to maintain them, to rebuild them eventually, and to drive is dwarfing that cost of congestion. So which number are we trying to actually lower, and which would be more effective to lower? And then looking at what was the population change and the job change, I was really interested in what was the population change in downtown from 1960 to 2000, because in around 2000 is when a lot of cities across the country had an inflection point where they were losing people. And then after 2000, there's been a market shift, largely because of millennials entering the workforce and wanting that walkable urban life. And so a lot of cities have seen a bounce back, particularly Sunbelt cities like Charlotte, like Dallas, that from 1960 to 2000, there's a huge population drop. So the 38% is not necessarily the drop. It's that in 2000, the population of downtown was 38% of what it was before. And so the doubling that's happened since 2000 is still under what it was in 1960, even though there's obviously been lots of growth in downtown Charlotte. And job change has increased since 2002. Unfortunately, I couldn't find job numbers in downtowns from 1960 all across the country, so I wasn't able to do an apples to apples on that. Now, this is another, this is part of that chart of the highway function ratio that I mentioned earlier, which is a ratio here of the peak versus off-peak speeds. So in many cities, peak speeds tend to be pretty slow. It's because when most people are driving, 8 a.m., 5 p.m., whatnot. And so these different quadrants are where highways fail at all times. They're just not working day, night, midday, off-peak, whatever. Where they're up here in this quadrant, it means the highways are working great all day long. That means there's not much traffic, even in peak hours. And what that means is it's probably failing the local economy, right? There's not enough activity. There's not enough trips. There's not enough people moving around, even at peak hours. And so what this tracks with, though, is that these cities where highways are failing at all times, those are high GDP cities per capita. They're the rich, wealthy, successful cities. Up here, these are low GDP cities. These are where highways work the best. These are your Flint, Michigans, your Youngstown, Ohio's, your Detroit's, cities that are effectively failing. And that's where I get to that these highways are failing their local economies. The last chart that I have of the atlas is charting that induced demand, highway lane miles per capita on a metro-wide basis versus how much people are driving. Charlotte's kind of in the middle of overall highway capacity, but a little elevated on how much people drive compared to the rest of the country. So that gets back to sort of what is the purpose of this and what are we trying to achieve? And that's when I ask the question, who designs the city and with what in mind? And so a highway, like those highways that are functioning great, but the cities aren't doing well, highways function best with little to no traffic on the road, right? There's no potential for collisions because nobody else is on the road, so it's safer, yada, yada, yada. but city streets function best with many people on the road. And so the engineer's level of service versus the economist's level of service are very different. They're opposite in effect. And why is because we put limited access infrastructure where we want abundant access. And we should be thinking about streets and street networks that actually create abundant access. And that's where I create this sort of paradigm of the logic of infrastructure and places. And so what places are where the infrastructure is economically destructive is the highway logic. It's single purpose, it's linear, it's impersonal, it's highly regulated, it's about limited access, and it's exclusive just to people who can own, operate, and afford a car. Versus the urban logic, which is it's about multi-purpose, multi-directional, it's very personal, it's regulated by social norms, and it creates abundant access and anybody can be there, it's inclusive. Ultimately, the infrastructure of highways through cities is clumsy and expensive versus urban places are elegant and productive. So that brings me to the question of I-77, and I've heard there's ideas of potentially double decking it because you probably want to add capacity without adding more real estate because it's expensive. Well, that made me think of I-35 in Austin, which is double decked. Similar size city, similar size metro to Charlotte. It's got 14 total lanes currently. And of course, TxDOT wants to widen it even further. You've got 4 lanes above, 4 lanes below, and 6 lanes of frontage roads. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, it's failing from a transportation perspective. Will widening it help? Well, it's also very expensive real estate. So the question becomes to double deck, to widen, or maybe something else. And I think to ask this question, we have to understand the traffic. Where is it going? Ask if the traffic belongs there in the first place. If it's regional and interstate and just passing through, well, why not go around? You've got a full beltway. If local and going to downtown and the greater downtown vicinity, well, why not get onto the surface network earlier? Which makes me look at the network. And you've got not just 77, but you've got these weird little stubs creating loops around downtown. And so this doesn't necessarily answer the question of I-77 right now, but I would be removing these stubs. And once you remove one part of the loop, well, then you can remove the other part because you don't need that. And then you can remove that because that's not needed either. And so personally, I-77, I don't know what the question is there, but I would be starting at removing some of those highways around, creating that loop around downtown. So again, don't be thinking about corridors, be thinking about networks, not thinking about connecting A to B in long distances, but connecting A, B, C, D, and Z. That's where I contrast I-345 in Dallas versus Champs-Élysées in Paris. I-345 is moving, say, 150, 160,000 cars per day. Champs-Élysées is moving 80,000 cars per day, so half on less space, but then also moving 500,000 pedestrians. Who knows how many crossing the streets, and then 1 million people on the subway below every single day. Highly functional. The economic value is 10 times per square foot. So it's working from a transportation perspective. It's working from an economic perspective. And that's where I want to offer the QR code anybody can scan, and that brings you to a free way to either download or review the entire atlas of intercity highway impacts. And if you're, whether you're in Charlotte or somebody else in somewhere else in the country, I probably have your city in there. So happy to open it up to Connie for any possible questions or follow-ups.
Yes, well, thank you again so much. That's I appreciate the kind of Charlotte specific data you looked at. So just to give Charlotteans a little bit better idea of what we're looking at, like if we build the proposed elevated toll lanes. Can you talk a little bit more about what the situation was with the elevated lanes that kind of promoted or prompted your original investigation? Like where were they in their life cycle, and what was the question there?
Yeah, so at 345 in specific in Dallas, I was basically looking at the downtown highway loop and asked the question, okay, there's plans for 3 of these sides that TxDOT has, but nobody was talking about 345. And so that's when I started to dig into its history, found that it was structurally failing and approaching the end of its useful life. And ultimately, TxDOT ended up spending several tens of millions to do some repair. And so they're saying, well, we can make it stand for another 10, 20 years. And my question was, okay, well, why? And so, okay, standing for another 10, 20 years, we don't have to make a decision. I said, well, the problems it's creating is still experienced today. And ultimately, after TxDOT did their city map study and came back and said, well, it's going to stand till 2040. We don't have to make any decisions now on it. The business community came and said, well, we need to expedite that. And so that's when they organized and funded a third study after that I led, which came back and said, the problem is now investors want to make decisions on their real estate, even that's not the land under the highway, basically the adjacent land. They wanted to know what was going to happen. They want to make decisions now. And so they created that expedited study that the Regional Transportation Council then picked up to create a fourth study, which ultimately has come back to say they want to do a below grade trench. So effectively, I lost that battle. But my current stance is we'd be better off not doing anything than building a wider, highly expensive below grade trench that doesn't have much economic impact. So it was at the end of its lifespan, but not anymore. So my point broadly, though, was if we're thinking about any of these highways, we need to be thinking about, okay, they've got 30-year lifespan. Whatever we invest and build, we should be thinking about what kind of city do we want in 2050, not how many cars are there now, how many we project to be there in 2050. Think about the city that you want and start planning for that.
Yeah, and kind of on that point, could you just talk a little bit more about how restoring the grid system and removing the highways that cut through them, how that kind of the dynamics that make that work better as a transportation system?
That makes me think about every Armageddon that ever happened, whether it was the West Side Highway in Manhattan, when it was removed, what happened was 53% of the traffic disappeared, because it was actually going from New Jersey to New Jersey and using Manhattan as a cut through. And so a lot of the traffic just vanished and the service streets did better. Similarly in Seattle, where they used to have the Alaskan Way viaduct along the waterfront. It was an elevated highway, and they wanted to, they also had a battle of what to do in the future. And the debate was, do they want a surface street or do they want a below grade tunnel? Ultimately, they chose the tunnel and a big surface street. And there was a 3-week period where there was neither the tunnel nor the elevated highway, and traffic was just fine, because the city ended up investing in additional transit during that time. And some people worked from home. We've got remote work now, so there's not the same kind of demand loads at 9 and 5. And surface streets work just fine. And what's been funny is that that particular tunnel was then promoted to that it would pay for itself with tolls. But the thing that happens with tolls is that it reduces demand further. And so the traffic counts aren't actually hitting what they projected. So it's not generating the revenue that it was projected. And further, the tunnel is having negative structural impacts at the real estate around it too. So it's been bad in basically every way possible. And so I think that gets back to that point, is that people and trips adapt, but you also have to be proactive in planning for and encouraging all those other modes, because you're not just saying, okay, we're going to have 100% of cars replace 100% of cars. It's say, okay, how do we replace 100% of trips with remote connections via the internet? How do we reroute around the metro area on beltways? How do we use the surface network? How do we replace trips with transit, right? So using every mode of connection to accommodate that, and maybe even do better than what the highway can do.
Let's see. So you also talked about how interchanges being closer than 2 miles apart is kind of part of how they fail so catastrophically. Did you happen to look at how many of our interchanges in Charlotte are much closer than that?
I think you have 3 in the downtown area, because where 77 has 2 of the loop, and then where the stub comes into the loop. I would guess, I didn't measure them, but I would guess they're about a mile or a little over a mile, since your loop is a little bit bigger than Dallas's. But I would assume they are under that 2 mile threshold, and it probably causes problems.
Yeah, I know we have local exits also that are much closer than that. And that's kind of where some of the failures are happening right now on 77.
Yeah, ripples through the street network then at those access points. And that's the fundamental tension with inner city highways, is that part of you wants as many access points as possible to disperse the traffic. But then once you do that, you have too many of them and they don't work. Or you go the opposite direction and say, well, we want no access points and to facilitate throughput of the traffic. Once you do that, though, you say, what's the point of the highway if it's no access points? And so that's that odd tension, I think, that points to the failure in the logic.
So this particular project is being proposed to be funded through what's called a P3, which is a public-private partnership.
Mm-hmm.
And that's partially because our state DOT does not have the funds to do it themselves. So if people are saying, well, private money is going to help us build this, and that kind of justifies the investment because we're not having to put the money in ourselves now. Are there any arguments you would say about like if that makes sense or it still doesn't work out?
I would be very concerned about, because that sounds to me like a magic bullet. Like, hey, we can expand this and private interests are happy to jump in. There is no shortage of privately invested toll roads that have gone bankrupt because they're not generating the same returns that were expected, because you take that same traffic planning logic of saying, traffic go up, and then say, okay, well, if traffic goes up, well, it's just going to generate revenue at the same rate. Well, once you put the tolls, like I mentioned, that's a suppressor of demand, and you end up getting like half or less of the actual revenue that you were expecting to. And so I would consider that a very risky investment from a private investment standpoint. And I mean, if you're going to do that, you want to maximize demand, right? So it's almost perverse what the incentives are there, that you want to put as many cars through there as possible and have as much traffic as possible when the intention is to reduce congestion. So again, you end up with that competing dynamic. So to me, it doesn't make any sense.
Yes. And so one of the ways that I like to talk about congestion is that it's like the physical manifestation of demand. It is us seeing the demand in action.
And concentrating it. And yes. Concentrating it at time, mode, and location rather than spreading it around.
And so like it's economically, we don't want to eliminate the demand. We want the demand to stay there, but how can we increase access? And what you talked about with the Champs-Élysées is how there are multiple modes moving there and how much that facilitates more access and therefore more commerce and social interaction than the highway network can. I know in your graph you showed kind of the need, and we're kind of in the quadrant that needs more transit. So can you talk about how transit would help us solve the traffic coming from suburbs into the city better than the highway can?
Yeah, I mean, transit, as long as you grade separate it, it's going to be far more efficient in moving people because ultimately, like you mentioned, you want more trips. More trips means better economy, it means higher GDP. And that's why when you chart congestion to GDP, the most congested cities are the highest GDP. They're the ones that can actually afford congestion. So which do you want to get rid of? Do you want to get rid of the congestion or do you want to get rid of the GDP? So that's part of it. And the other part is, you're going to be investing, let's say $1 billion on each project either way. And when I have that study from the Upjohn Institute and the FHWA, do you want actual return on your investment? And if you spend $1 billion on a highway project, is it going to improve anything? Probably not. If you spend $1 billion on a transit project, that probably is, if it's probably planned, it's probably going to have significant returns because you also have the transit-oriented development effect of having greater returns on the real estate. And then beyond that, I think it's not just about adding transit to an existing highway system. I think it's important to also be removing some of those highways as well, because in a book on the history of the DC metro system, they compared Atlanta versus DC, and DC chose in the 1960s and 70s to build their metro system rather than a highway loop through downtown, because there was supposed to be one in DC. And now on the DC side, there's effectively like no highways. It's all on the Virginia side. And Atlanta, on the other hand, built transit and built highways. And so they wanted to contrast, or that book contrasted what happened then, because Atlanta built both, DC just built transit. And the result was, obviously, DC has higher density in their city. They've got much higher trip capture on their metro system than Atlanta does too. And so to me, it's not about both and, it's really either or, and getting both of them in the right place. And that's where the Paris story comes in, right? It's having the transit where you want most people and they want the highest density and the most trips, and then having the highways outside that.
I'm glad Atlanta came back up, because Charlotte really likes to think that we still have the opportunity to not become Atlanta. But we're only, I think when I looked at the top 10 amount of acreage within the 3-mile radius, we're like only 9 acres behind Atlanta right now. So if we do allow the I-77 project to go forward, I'm sure we'll just tip right over, either be right with them or surpass them on that. And I think that's a really good point, that it's not either or, it's kind of like you need to move from one to another.
Exactly.
And Charlotte has set forth, we have lots of climate goals, we have a strategic mobility plan that's won awards. And I think the frustration that a lot of Charlotteans are having is we're not moving forward with it. And instead we're kind of allowing the things we said we don't want to do anymore to continue to happen. And so kind of on that, to kind of wrap us up, ultimately, what do you think might have made you successful in getting your alternative proposal to happen in Dallas? And what might we take away here in Charlotte that might help us be successful here?
Yeah, I think to your initial point about sort of the climate goals and strategic mobility plans, at the end of the day, those are all plans and goals, but they need a budget. And what has the budget? Well, for the most part, it's state and federal highways, right? The IIJA had something like $150 billion in it for highways passed in 2021. It's expiring this year. What's going to happen next? Probably just a continuing resolution to spend the same amount of money for the next 5 years. What made, I wouldn't say I was successful, but I did create a campaign, and it got a lot of attention and created the conversation, which led to TxDOT looking at it. Was that I specifically used the economic impact to be a Trojan horse to have the broader conversations, right? Because talking about the environmental impact wasn't going to register in Dallas, right? So all I focused on was, what does this mean from a tax base, from a municipal standpoint? And what does this mean for big investors that want to make money? And that's when we ended up shifting where the business community was at locally, and the business community effectively determines a lot here politically. And so, we've had a big turnover on city council in 10 years of elections based on this one issue. So I think it's finding what the hot buttons issues are locally, what moves the needle, versus what do we think or want to move the needle, what really moves the needle, and focus on those things. I don't know Charlotte politics well enough. It sounds to me like your city tends to be more progressive than, say, Dallas is. And so maybe those things matter. But until there's a stopping of the flow of dollars from the state and federal level into metro areas, or at least a rethinking of that logic, there's not much we can do. Basically, it's David versus Goliath. And I think part of this leads to a much bigger conversation about what do we want transportation bills to look like going forward, and how do we stop them from ruining our cities and furthering car dependence and the high cost of car dependence.
Yes, well, that does seem to be what our next conversation has to be nationwide. So thank you again so much for sharing all of this. And is there anything else that you wish I would have asked that you wanted to talk about that we didn't touch on?
No, I think that's probably it. Spent a lot of time talking, so.
All right. Well, thank you again so much for sharing this with us so that we can get the word out to people here in Charlotte so we can make this kind of economic argument when we're discussing any of these transportation investments moving forward.
Of course, happy to help and hope that was helpful.